Good afternoon. I just start talking, whereas more people are entering our Zoom room. So good afternoon, but also good morning, good evening, or maybe even good night, depending on the time zone you're in. We saw in the registration that people all over the world have actually registered for this event. So welcome. My name is Elisabet Rasch, and I'm the chair of the ABv, the Antropologen Beroepsvereniging, or the Dutch Association of Anthropologists. And it's really an honor to welcome you all to this webinar, Remote Ethnography, Doing Anthropology Digitally. This is actually the first ABv webinar that we are organizing as a tryout of a series of webinars that we are planning to organize together with LaSSA. LaSSA is a student network of Dutch anthropologists. And we organize these webinars as a kind of replacement of our yearly get-together, the Anthropology Day. The next webinar will probably be about being a student and student life in times of Corona, of a pandemic. It will be organized in March, April, but please keep an eye on our website, on our Facebook page to get more information about this. Today we are here to talk about remote methods, remote ethnography. And when we opened up the registration for the event, we found out how topical, how urgent, how important this theme is. We were completely overwhelmed by the enormous amount of registrations and the attention for the event. And of course, also extremely happy to have all of you here. I think it's the first time that we are so global, so to say. I won't take too much time to talk about our association and the Dutch anthropologists. I think we have to move on quickly to our three great speakers, Elisabetta, Sonja, and John. They will all share their own experiences with doing remote research. And we will engage in a structured Q&A with each of them. But before we move on to that, I will briefly introduce Nikkie Wiegink. She's the co-moderator of this event. Nikkie works as an assistant professor at the Cultural Anthropology Department of Utrecht University and is also a board member of the ABv. You can drop all your questions in the chat. We will collect them after we have finished the structured Q&A. And please also just use the chat for posing dropping your questions. I don't have an eye on the list of participants, but we are quite many. So please use the chat for your questions and we will try to attend to all of them. This event is recorded, so it will be possible to look at it afterwards as well, but maybe it's also good to keep that in mind. And I guess now, Nikkie, the floor is yours to introduce our participants and pose the first question of the Q&A, and I will stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elisabet. So in this webinar, we are very happy to have three experts on remote or digital ethnography. And first we have Elisabetta Costa, who is assistant professor at Media and Journalism Studies at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. We have also Dr. Sonja Marzi, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Methodology and the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And we have John Boy, Dr. John Boy, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology at Leiden University, also in the Netherlands. I will delve right into the first question. And I would like to ask you two things. First of all, to tell us briefly something very shortly about your remote or digital research project. And then secondly, to say something about the main difference you see between remote ethnographic research, and normal, whatever that may be, but normal ethnographic research. Do you see one as an extension of the other, or are there different methods, tools? And I would like Elisabetta, can I invite you to start?
Okay, yes, hello, hi everybody. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk in front of such a big audience. Okay, so as Nikki said, I'm a digital anthropologist, and I'm currently based at the Department of Media Studies at the University of Groningen. And as a digital anthropologist, have a training in social anthropologies, and I've been working on social media for the last 14 years, since I started my PhD back in 2007. And one of my missions as a scholar is to bring more anthropological approaches into media studies, and to bring also more anthropological methods into media studies. So what I've been doing as a scholar all these years, I've been doing traditional long-term ethnographic fieldwork to study social media and the impact that social media has on people's everyday life. Starting from a research that I carried out when I was a postdoctoral researcher at UCL, Department of Anthropology. That was part of a larger project that was run by Professor Daniel Miller. As part of that project, I carried out 15 months traditional ethnography in a medium-sized town in the southeast of Turkey. And I was looking at the uses of social media and the impact that social media had on people's everyday life. How did I do that research? I did traditional ethnographic fieldwork, meaning that I spent 15 months in this medium-sized town looking at how people use social media. So I was hanging out with them, I was having dinner with them, I was going to the shopping malls together with my research participants, and at the same time, I friended them on social media, mostly Facebook, because that was the most used platform back then. And I was also observing what they did on Facebook. So I was continuously comparing the online and the offline presentation of the self. I was comparing online, offline practices. But at the same time, I also carry out a more systematic analysis of the visual post, of the visual images. And I asked my research participants to help me understand why people posted that kind of images. Then in the last 4 years, when I moved to Groningen, I also moved my research from the Middle East to Italy, to the north of Italy. And I started a research project in 2019. And I've been working on the role of digital platform on self-promotion among unemployed and precarious workers in the north of Italy. And even in this case, I did traditional fieldwork in Milan. And I was about to continue this research, but I had to stop because of the pandemic. And so in 2020, I also had to readjust my plan, and I started doing remote ethnography. And how did I do that? First of all, I changed research question a bit, and I, of course, changed method. I was sitting here in Groningen, and I did a lot of interviews, and I started focusing more on the role of WhatsApp in mediating personal relationships during the time of lockdown. As you probably know, Milan was hit very hard by the pandemic, and in March, April, people were sitting at home. They could not leave their home. And I was studying the role of WhatsApp in mediating personal relationships at distance. And I did a lot of interviews, and I asked my research participants to take their phones and to open WhatsApp, and I asked them to tell me exactly who did they interact with the most in those weeks and months. And I asked them also to tell me what kind of content they shared with them. And then I did participant observation on WhatsApp groups online. So I would talk more, but I would like to close this first introduction with my main message, which is, if we want to do remote ethnography, let's go back to the principle of traditional ethnographic fieldwork to come up with innovative and creative solutions for remote digital ethnography. And then I hope I will have the time to continue this conversation later on. Thank you.
You will definitely have the time to continue the conversation. And I think that's a very good start to start thinking creatively of how we can do this remote fieldwork or ethnography. Sonja, can I ask you to introduce your project and to say something about the differences for you between remote and whatever normal again is ethnography?
Sure. Yeah, hello everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I'm also a little bit overwhelmed by the number of people who have signed up for it, but not necessarily surprised. We are all a little bit challenged by how we continue our work, so remote is the way to go now. So yeah, I'm Sonja Marzi. I'm at the LSE in the Department of Methodology. I teach in international development. I'm actually teaching research design and methodology to international development students. And I just received a new grant, so now I also become a part of the Latin American and Caribbean Center at LSE, which is pretty exciting. In my research, I'm actually having 3 lines of inquiry, and I'm not going to all 3 lines because that's not necessarily relevant here. But 2 years ago, I started a project which is about the gendered right to the city for women in Medellin. Elisabet knows that one pretty well. And what I'm doing there is that I'm interested on how women appropriate space and place in Medellin and how they can participate in forming space and place. Very, very briefly, very superficially explained. So that research was supposed to continue in a more participatory way, and I got a LSE Knowledge Exchange and Impact Fund to do a participatory video project. So the initial idea for us was that we would actually pack our bags. I'm working with a professional film crew, which is here based in London together. And we wanted to fly to Medellin and we wanted to produce a film with the women together about their gendered right to the city. And this kind of work relies heavily on co-presence between researcher, practitioner, and participants. We were supposed to go in July 2020. So when the pandemic hit, we obviously weren't able to do that. And I really had to rethink, how can I actually continue with my co-production research when I actually can't be co-present with my participants in one place? And the idea came that I was thinking that, okay, all of these women I'm working with luckily have a smartphone. So the idea was that instead of we going there, training them and filming and how to edit with professional equipment, we actually do all this remotely and ask the women to film the videos with their smartphones. So that meant actually, in comparison to the initial research design, that we had to create a complete new one. So when it comes to thinking about what are the differences, and we may not necessarily talk about ethnography here, but probably for ethnography that's similar, it's, in my case, it has become a complete different research design than it was actually planned in the past. So we were lucky, we did something which we call a little bit like WhatsApp snowballing. I'm lucky that I have a research assistant in Medellin and my network as well, it was pretty good established. So what we were doing in that time is like we were asking women to connect to other women over WhatsApp. The reason for that is that at that time in Medellin, lockdown was also the case. So women weren't able to leave their houses and we had to find a way to communicate to each other, and WhatsApp is for free. So once we had recruited the women, what we did is we had one WhatsApp group. We were all in one WhatsApp group and started training them with training videos how to enter Zoom. Because at some point we had to find a way to create online workshops. So we started training them with online videos and with question and answer sessions through WhatsApp, how they can enter Zoom and how they can participate in Zoom. And from there onwards, now for over 9 months almost, we are now in weekly Zoom sessions of 3 hours every Monday. And we trained women in how they can film with a smartphone in a way that we can edit it. We discussed and reflected on the contents. We shifted the topic from the gendered right to the city to what is the impact of COVID on their everyday lives in the city. And then we are at the moment actually at a point where we even found a way to edit online so that the women can become directors of the final film. So at the moment, we hope we are finishing the film in February. I also have to say much of this work has been on the backs of the two filmmakers who obviously had the knowledge of how can we create the training material, etc., and how to edit. And they are doing a lot of editing work. I probably could spend a whole hour talking about this, but I stop here and yeah, just throw your questions at me for everything else you want to know.
Okay, thank you so much for starting at least to talk about your project and for sharing a bit of your experience with shifting your research design. I think we most of us have that challenge, are faced with that challenge at the moment. John, can I invite you to tell us something about your project and the difference you see between remote and perhaps other kinds of ethnography?
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining. And I was hoping I would be the first who gets to say this, and I am, which is that I'm especially impressed that we are competing with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and yet we still drew over 300 participants to watch. So, yay! Yeah, the project I would mostly want to focus on today in my remarks is a project that I'm doing with an urban geographer here in Amsterdam. That's Amsterdam out there. And we've been working together for the last 6 years on something that is now turning into a book with the subtitle Instagram, the Self, and the City. And this is work that I started, like I said, pretty much exactly 6 years ago. And our work is situated in Amsterdam. So it's remote in a different sense. It's not that my field site is far away. In fact, I can walk around it all the time. But the way we started is we wanted to study kind of the role of social media in general, but especially Instagram in people's just everyday relations within the city. Very broadly understood. That was kind of our broad starting point. And we felt that in order to be able to study this kind of interface between everyday life, everyday spaces, and Instagram, we couldn't just start from any physical place in the city, but we wanted to kind of see basically, first of all, where the action was. So 6 years ago today, pretty much, I was mostly a programmer and less a qualitative researcher, and I wrote a tool to collect data from Instagram, which at the time was much more easily possible, to collect geolocated posts that were based inside the city, which we then proceeded to analyze in a number of different ways in order to get a feel for, okay, where is this interface between Instagram and the city, so that we can kind of construct our field site from that kind of data. And we collected something like 500,000 Instagram posts over the course of half a year that we mostly focused on, posted only by local users, but which we defined as users that post at least twice, I think 30 days apart. And also the interactions between them, which were, I think, about 16 million interactions. So this is kind of big data. And so the posts themselves, we could analyze geographically to get a sense for, okay, where are people posting from, and so on and so forth, get a sense of what the hotspots are that people like to post about, which we later came to interpret as basically kind of the urban stages and urban props that people mobilize for status displays on Instagram. The other thing we did was network analysis of these posts, which allowed us, first of all, to see who's getting the most attention. And as many of you might be aware, on social media, attention seems to follow a kind of long tail distribution where a very small share of people get a lot of attention, and most people get a kind of middling to low amount of attention. So we were able to see kind of who are those breakout stars, the people that locally that are able to get a lot of attention. And the other thing we were able to do with network techniques was to get a sense of, okay, what are the different groups of people that are represented, often organized, not necessarily geographically, but around shared lifestyles, professions, consumer choices, and so on. So you see a lot of nightlife based groups. Then you see things like CrossFit users and people that go to evangelical churches. They kind of cluster together. And that gave us a sense, okay, these are the kinds of people that are using Instagram in their everyday lives in relation to the city and also where they're doing it. And that gave us a starting point for doing interviews and also doing participant observation in those places. And so it was remote in the sense that we framed our field site, you know, from a kind of remote point, meaning from this platform data. And that work has continued, becoming kind of progressively more qualitative as we get a sense of, okay, what the field site looks like. And like I said, we started 6 years ago, did a lot of interviews within that first year, the first 2 years, then did more observational research in different settings because we became interested in how places are designed specifically for an Instagram aesthetic, how they change over time, how people that curate those places make certain kind of choices to make them more appealing for representation on Instagram. And then we also started doing follow-up interviews more recently with people that we spoke to early on in the research, because we're interested in how people's mentalities and sensibilities around Instagram are shaped and how they change over time. So the project became more qualitative in the sense that we did more on-site observation and interviews, which have also been more and more remote over the last year, of course. So that's broadly speaking the project. Comparing it to normal ethnography, here I have to make a little bit of a confession, which is that I never really was a normal ethnographer to begin with. I come from sociology, and my dissertation research was multi-sided, and it was urban ethnographic, but it was quite focused in the sense that because it was multi-sided, I did shorter, more data-intensive stints in different locations. So I think that was good preparation in a way for pivoting to this kind of hybrid mixed methods research project, which I still understand broadly as ethnographic because it has this kind of what Elisabetta talks about as the kind of adaptive approach, inventive approach. You know, we're kind of making our own tools as we're going along and so on. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much for introducing us to your topic. And I think it will be hard to find the normal ethnographer anyway, but this already gives some insight in how you all actually combine sources such as WhatsApp, but also film and Zoom and Instagram, to then build further on in some kind of in-depth interviewing as well, and while also collecting different kinds of data. Elisabet Rasch, in this case, you will ask the second question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks so much for your answers to the first question. And I see all kinds of very interesting questions popping up in the chat as well, but we will come to that later. For now, we would like to ask you to reflect a little bit on the specific ethical implications of doing remote research. And I would like to ask Sonja first to have a little bit of change of order here. Sonja, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Elisabet. I guess the ethical question is probably something I should write a paper about at some point, because it is pretty big in my case. So there are two main dimensions we have to think about when we do this work. What I do, this is one, that we still have to think about local ethical and risk implications. So we have to think about the women's context and their local consequences of taking part in the research. But going into remote and an online environment means that we have to also think about technological and data in a way we didn't do before. So let me start with the first one, which is that the women I'm working with, they are from low socioeconomic background. Many of them are head of household. Many of them are some form of migrant, be it displaced or economic migrant, or you name it. And they are living in areas that are often violence and crime affected. So the risk assessment for them in this research has ethical implications in itself. So we have to think about that. So even prior to the pandemic, for them, moving around with a camera and doing filming, or let's say with professional film equipment, is not without risk anyway. And they wouldn't have done that alone prior to the pandemic. So now we are in a pandemic where they can't necessarily mingle in the same way as they did before. They can't be in groups together. So we really have to think about risk in different ways. Plus that we are obviously having health risks that we don't want them to actually go out so much, being in risk of infection. There's also the question, how much can we ask them to participate in research, especially in my case, which is heavily co-produced, heavily participatory, while they have so much going on in their own life. They have care responsibilities, they may have for children or for elderly, they have to find some way for getting food. They have to, the majority of them are in informal employment. So they have a lot of things going on in their private life, and that actually shows us that we have to take ethics here pretty serious to really think about their context and what can we ask of people we are working with. So this is something which we could make a paper on itself here, because that's pretty big. And obviously I had to go through an ethical review. But there are also things we have to think about when it comes to the technology. So they're the obvious ones, that we need to find ways to create content. And we did that actually through videos. So we made video dialogues, explained the research, and asked them for informed consent over a video. So this gave them already time to practice to make videos. But then there are also things like, how do we share the data? How do we store it? How do they send the videos to us? Who has access to the data locally? Who has access to the data while it is saved on a cloud? So lots of these questions where we had to go through and really think about different processes, how that works. I think one of the things I didn't actually think about so much before the research is that for us, it's very normal. We go into Zoom, we use our phone, we know how to manage them, we know how to email stuff, we know that we can use different ways of emailing, email bigger kinds of data. But the videos, for example, you can't easily send them through email because they're becoming too big. So we already decided to limit them in a certain amount of minutes so that we have ways to send them. So we had to find different ways to send them through apps. And there are different ones. You can use OneDrive, you can use WeTransfer, whatever it is. The problem is the women don't have a computer either necessarily. So the majority has a smartphone. So not being able to do that easily creates a form of frustration, and could actually lead to kind of internally quitting the project and being frustrated of not being able to do that, which can have loads of other consequences we do not want. So we really have to think about these things in advance and think about how do we train the women in a way that this becomes a capacity building project rather than a frustration project. So these are loads of different things we can think about, but on the other hand, I do also have like this point, like especially when it comes to things like where we talked in the beginning about that we have to do a risk assessment and there's loads of danger for them leaving the house. On the other hand, they do have a lot of agency. They do know their neighborhood. And I think we also need to be careful that we don't use an ethics process to patronize our participants. So what we did at the end is that we highlighted these things, but we create guidelines. And we do them on a regular basis because similar as here in Europe, in Medellin, the context changes with the pandemic. So we have regular sessions where we talk about, okay, if we go out videoing or filming, what are the implications of that for your own safety? What are the ethical things we have to think about? Plus guidelines and rules of filming itself, right? Who can be in the video, minors, etc. But I'm not going into those because I think those are more obvious. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sonja. I think it was really good or interesting that you also mentioned that although it's about remote and digital, that the ethical implications are also very local and really anchored in the lives of the people that we work with. So I think yeah, it's really important to keep that in mind as well. John, can I invite you to share your ethical dilemmas?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, a lot of it is kind of established principles and protocols. You know, we still applied, which, you know, informed consent and minimizing harm and so on. But yeah, pretty quickly with the kind of project that I just described, we kind of entered new territory for us. And the places where we looked for guidance, basically two. One was how would you, yeah, like internet research, basically. So people that that do research on online interaction. And the second was kind of computational social science, people that deal with large amounts of data. And from the internet researchers, so the Association of Internet Researchers, they actually have an ethics document that's very helpful. It details a lot of different principles and ways of thinking. They highlight that it's not about, you know, having a one-size-fits-all policy, but interrogating what you do with data and in your relationships with research participants and so on. And one important principle from internet research is the principle of contextual integrity. So the idea that you don't share information outside of the or in violation of the information norms under which it was shared. So people that, you know, it's very easy, I think, for researchers to say, well, people post stuff publicly on Instagram, so I can do with it whatever I want. And it's and that's something that we very quickly stayed away from, which is why our publications, at least our early ones, have no pictures in them, which my friends always said, you're writing on Instagram and you're not showing pictures. Well, we always felt like, okay, we can't kind of violate the contextual integrity of how those images were shared, which by taking them off Instagram and putting them in an academic journal, we would definitely be doing, unless we built those relationships to people, which we did over the time of the project. We're able to explain to them what we were hoping to learn about. Also, we had to get a better sense of our own research question as we were going along, so that we could really explain what the context was in which we were talking about people's Instagram posts, for instance. And then we built the relationships with research participants where they said, yes, you may use my image in your article, for instance. And then we would show them the part of the article that we were writing, talking about their experiences, showing the image, how the image would be placed on the page, and basically letting the informant sign off on that. So that was one important one. And then the other set of issues that comes more from, I guess, computational social science, has to do with, you know, how do you manage this kind of data, and what different new kinds of harms might emerge from these kinds of data, and what you know, to what extent is maybe informed consent no longer enough. And one of the things that comes up, especially in research with network analysis, is that even if you have informed consent from participants, and even if you're following, you know, the established ethics protocols, something like revealing metadata, a term that we all know, I think, since the Edward Snowden revelations, can already expose people that are not really research participants to risk. So just talking about who is interacting with whom, without necessarily saying anything about the content of what they're saying, can already compromise confidentiality and de-identification and things like that. So so there again, we opted to be very careful. And they're the Norwegian scientific organization. They have a set of guidelines about how you can de-identify people that you're talking about by never quoting verbatim, because you know, anything that's online can be found by searching for it and so on, and by masking identities and so on. So that those were two big discussions that we had as part of our research.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this idea of privacy on the internet that people have when they actually share stuff, and it's not that private. It's really, I think, yeah, I'm glad that it came to the fore in this your reflection. Elisabetta, can I give you the floor?
Yeah, okay, yes, Elisabeth. All right, so I would like to discuss two main ethical issues, and one is similar to what John has just discussed, and it has to do with problems of anonymization and privacy protection. Digital ethnography is more complicated in that sense because information online are more easily searchable and more easily traceable. And unlike offline reality, it's easier to go back to this information that are available there online and to understand who posted that kind of comments, who posted that image. So how can we maintain the anonymity of our research participants in our final articles, papers, or books? I go back to one article that was written by Annette Markham. She has been writing extensively on ethics and internet research, so that's a very good source for those of you who are dealing with these issues. And she wrote an article called Fabrication as Ethical Practice. And what she suggests is to switch details around. So whenever we are describing a research participants, we do not necessarily have to copy and paste exactly the comments they posted or to use exactly the same image. We cannot do that because it's easily traceable. But again, and the principle I mentioned in the beginning, the importance of going back to the principles of traditional long-term anthropological fieldwork. This is something that anthropologists, to some extent, have always done. Okay? So to maintain the anonymity of my research participants in my Kurdish town, I also had to change some details when I was writing my book. And that's the same for online research. I have to do it to a different extent because it's easier to trace back who said what. But that is the same principle. So let's change the details of my research participants. To make sure that nobody understands who I'm writing about. And then the second problem I've been facing in my last research is how I can pay back my research participants, how I can compensate. This is something that is easier to do in traditional ethnography. It's more difficult in online ethnography, and I don't have an easy solution for it. So when I did all these interviews last year, I was promising beers as soon as the pandemic was over, and I'm looking forward. I've not forgot that. There are other ways to compensate our research participants, but there are no one simple solution. It really depends on who they are, what the context is. You can be more active in the WhatsApp group. You can entertain them. You can share memes if they like memes, or you can be silent if they are sick of all these WhatsApp comments. Yeah, so be creative and adjust what you do to the contingencies of the research. That's my suggestion.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, it's so fascinating to see how many things are also alike with what normal ethnography, like also the creativity, the flexibility, the rootedness, but still it's so multi-layered again. Thank you for that. And Nikki has one final general question for you before we will go into the questions that are popping up in the chat.
Yes, thank you. So our third and the final general question is very general and open. It's basically asking you for a golden tip or this one big great piece of advice for there are many students among the audience, for students, but also more established researchers, anyone actually who's who's embarking now on an ethnographic project. What should they absolutely do, or perhaps should they absolutely not do? So I'm asking you for your golden tip. John, can I ask you to start?
Sure. Yeah, I thought about this a little bit since I read the question, and it was hard to decide, but I decided to go with this concept that I think about keep coming back to, which is the Matthew Desmond, who's an urban ethnographer famous for a book on housing eviction. He wrote an article some years ago called Relational Ethnography, where he makes the argument that ethnographers can't just take a bounded object that they encounter somewhere as their object of analysis, but that, or shouldn't anyway. They shouldn't just say, I'm going to study this group or this place, but they should actively construct their object. And one of the ways to do that, in his view, is to look at relations between two or more actors. And for example, when he studies housing eviction, he studies the renters and the landlords and also all kinds of other people that are involved in that process, and to make that process basically the object of analysis. So to take this kind of a relational view. And I think one of the big opportunities of the remote ethnographic moment that we're maybe having is that it really, none of us can just be spontaneous about the object that we study, but we have to actively construct it. And taking this kind of a relational view, looking at what kinds of processes, what kind of constellations of actors are involved in what I want to study, is a real chance, is a real opportunity to make to do very insightful research, which comes with the trade-off of maybe having less depth and so on, but forces us to think more about what actually the object is that we're studying. So Matthew Desmond, relational ethnography, that's my silver bullet.
Okay, thank you. A very concrete one. We should all start reading that. Perfect. Thank you so much. Sonja, can I invite you to share your silver bullet, golden piece of advice?
Yeah, I think I have more practical advice. So my first thing is probably that we have to not see that necessarily as a disadvantage that we're going remotely. We may want to think about many opportunities that are opened up here. While it probably hinders a lot of people to continue with the research they did, I think with some flexibility and open-mindedness of what we can create, this is still possible. And when I talk about opportunities, I'm mainly actually talking about things that it offers lots of opportunities to decolonize what we are doing. Like it offers the opportunity to flatten hierarchies we have usually traditionally in our research designs. So looking from that lens at our research, we can actually think about, okay, if I'm often the white Western-based researcher can't go, in my case in development, to a country where I have definitely a position of power, what does that actually mean for the research I'm creating? So maybe we can shift our lens of how we look at what is fieldwork, how do we understand fieldwork, why do we do it? That may clash every now and then with academic expectations on us. And we can talk about academia and the problems that it creates with the system we have. But I think from a research perspective, it really can help to shift maybe the lens of how we think about fieldwork and data collection. And again, practical, being flexible and open to how change can really create these opportunities.
Thank you. I think that was a very fundamental point to help us start asking, why do we actually do fieldwork? Why do we have to be there? And
can I just add something to that? Because in the manner of pushing a little bit early careers publications, Marnie Howlett, she just published actually in Qualitative Research an article asking the question about fieldwork in COVID-19. So for people who are interested in that, that might be a good start.
Great. I think while we are talking, people are actually putting these links to different sources in the chat. So thank you. Super. Then Elisabetta, what is your piece of advice?
Yeah, I think my main piece of advice has to do with the importance of building relationships of trust with our research participants. And this takes time. So you cannot do it in 1 month, 2 months. You need long-term ethnography to do that. And that's even more important when we decide to study individualized forms of communication, private forms of communication, like WhatsApp groups or messengers communication or Telegram. These are private spaces, and the only way to gain access to this place is by building relationships of trust with our research participants. Otherwise, we end up studying only publicly available data and public platform. This is important, but on the other hand, there is so much going on in private space, and the only way to gain access to these places is with time. And this became particularly visible in my research in the southeast of Turkey when I was working on intimacy, love, flirting, and all the digitally mediated communications were taking place in the private chat of Facebook or WhatsApp or SMS. And only at the end of my fieldwork, after 1 year, 12 months, I was able to understand what was happening there. So especially if you are PhD students, you have time to do this. So take time to build relationships with your informants, friends, research participants, as you want to call them. This is my main piece of advice. And my second piece of advice is, again, if you don't know what to do, if you have to make choice, and go back again to the principles of traditional long-term anthropological fieldwork. I'm now supervising a brilliant PhD student, Wageningen, and she's doing a research on fandom and digital platforms, social media. And a couple of weeks ago, we were discussing how she could present herself on different social media platforms, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Tumblr. And the question I think she had to answer was, what can help you to build relationship with your research participants? What can help you to be accepted? First of all, and second, also, the second question is, what would you like to disclose to the research participants? And these are also the same question that I would ask if I was doing fieldwork in physical co-presence. What do I need to do? How do I present myself if I want to be accepted in a given community or context? If I do research in a Muslim conservative town, I would not wear a miniskirt, even if there are 45 degrees. And that's the same when I do research on fandom on Tumblr and Twitter. How do I need to present myself to be accepted? Yes, so these are the two main pieces of advice. Thanks.
Thank you already for touching on the subject of trust and these old principles of anthropology of building rapport and the researcher identity. And questions like this are just, of course, just as important in if we go into a digital world as outside. And these were also already questions that were in different ways asked in the chat. I will ask now Elisabet because in the meantime there are many questions in the chat. Meanwhile, we cherry pick a bit. We have some people who are moderating the chat, and so we pick some of the questions and pose them to you. Elisabet, can you pose the first one? Elisabet Rasch.
Yeah, well, I think we can link it to Elisabetta's final commentary, because it was also a question that appeared in the chat. So maybe we can invite Sonja and John to reflect also on this process of building trust and rapport from a distance remotely. Is this possible? How did you do it? Yeah. So yeah, Sonja, could you share a little bit about this process?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to romanticize that, because I do think it's actually one of the bigger challenges when doing remote research. Yeah, I mean, Elisabetta said already, like time is important, but when we are talking to our students, and especially my students, they don't have time. They have 3 months in the summer to do a dissertation. So that's an issue, obviously. And sometimes I actually do discourage them from doing co-production and participatory research, because time is really an issue. And I agree completely with Elisabetta. I mean, we are doing this project now for 9 months, and we have 3 hours per week in an online Zoom space, which are very different group dynamics than having these encounters where you're just hanging out with people. Like, these are so important in research, where you're just sitting together and you're spending time together and you get to know each other. What we have started is, and this came actually from the women in my study, they're asked to get an extra half an hour before each meeting. And we are meeting half an hour early, everybody who wants to, and we are talking about everyday life. Nothing with the project. It's really just how are you doing? What is happening in your life? I think much also has to do with how do you understand your role? Again, a little bit what Elisabetta touched upon. How much do you share about yourself? Yeah, like we often extract data rather than really co-produce something. And so we started doing videos of our environment. So training videos where we have to show how do you make long or short shots, or still shots and moving shots. We started doing this here as well. So I did it here in London, while one of the filmmakers in Italy, another one is also in Colombia. And we shared those as well to show them our environment. But I do think it is one of the big challenges. What we also do is, like, especially me, there's a mixture of group and individual interactions. So we have workshops, but I do try to connect them to them individually. So we have interviews in a one-to-one basis as well. Yeah. What we're going to do is, in the new project, so I just received funding to continue this, to actually think about how we can create a remote methodology during pandemics and emergencies in general when we do participatory research. And one of the things we're going to do is that we're actually going to link to women we haven't had any contact before. Because to half of the women in my current project, I did have contact before. We knew each other, we already had a relationship, and we knew each other face to face. So now we're going to do that in Bogota with a group of women we haven't seen before. And this will be very interesting, where we really have to think exactly about these processes. How do we create these trust relationships when we want to talk about pretty sensitive topics when it comes to their everyday life and the gendered right to the city? So yeah, who knows? Maybe I can tell more in 18 months.
Well, I hope so. Then we will invite you again. Thank you so much, Sonja. John, can I give you the word about this rapport and trust issue?
Sure. So in the process that I just described earlier, where we kind of took this, kind of macroscopic perspective at first through our network analysis and so on, and then contacted individual people, it was something that we had to think about. Like, first of all, I'm a guy in my 30s, and I'm emailing mostly women in their 20s about that I saw on Instagram. So there's already this kind of creep dynamic, let alone that I found them through some kind of weird data analysis process. So that was definitely something that I was thinking about a lot. And I had to think about sometimes about when you walk in the city late at night, and you realize, oh, I'm walking behind somebody who might be threatened by me, so you change the side of the road, like those kinds of tactics. Like, how can I make myself as non-threatening as possible in approaching people? became kind of became something I had to think about sometimes. So, but kind of professionalism, I guess, helps a lot. So, use a university email address, be very upfront about what you're doing, how you came across somebody, why you want to speak to them, and make it quite easy for them to say yes or no. I guess those are things that apply very often, but do that after having thought about all the possible creepiness and all the possible dynamics that are part of this this relationship that you're trying to form. So that's one thing that definitely comes to mind. Another thing I noticed is, because we also had master students and research interns and so on working with us, is that, for example, younger women who were working with us, they had a much easier time getting a response. So again, the kind of gender dynamic there was very apparent. Getting a response from people, being able to basically interview everybody that they wanted to, whereas I always felt like, oh, I got an email back. I also made the conscious decision to only contact people that published their email address or a website with a contact form. So I would never DM people. I would never slide into their DMs because, again, because of that same dynamic. If you are a younger student who maybe has something in common with the people you're trying to talk to, maybe the parameters will be different. But I erred on the side of being less creepy, I guess. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Elisabetta. I don't know if you still want to add something about trust and rapport.
Yeah, okay, very briefly. So in my last research, I was lucky because I built a relationship with my participants before the pandemic. So before I moved the research entirely online. And that's easier if you know your research participants already. So I don't have really first-hand experience on building relationships with people from scratch entirely online. But my general tip would be to participate and be present in social media groups, online platform, and not just observe. So take time to participate and also disclose something about yourself. That's a form of exchange. If you ask for questions, if you ask questions to your research participants, also tell something about yourself. Take part in the communications, in the interactions. That's my general feedback.
Yeah, so the good old ethnography again, right? Nikkie,
Thanks.
you thank you so much.
Yeah, there is a question, and here this question came up in the chat, and it is can digital ethnography be a core method rather than a substitute for real ethnography? And I actually wanted to, I would like to invite Sonja to reflect on that. Since you had to change your research design, what is your assessment so far?
As a matter of fact, I just wrote an article about it. Let's talk about it. So first of all, I'm not really an ethnographer in that sense. So we may talk about different things, and I think Elisabetta and I, we may have different ideas about what we understand here, because I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a geographer. So I talk about an ethnographic approach, which has normal things of like hanging out with each other and having parts of traditional ethnography in the research design, but it is not my core of the research design. So I'm a participatory researcher and a co-production geographer. That means I do believe, yes, it can become a core methodology. That's basically what I want to do in the next 18 months, because I do think we have to actually think more remotely. The idea that we are traveling several times per year into areas just from a climate change perspective is not sustainable in the future. And then we can go back to decolonization and so on, but I'm not going into this right now. So I do think remote participatory methods at least can become standalone methods. But I think when it comes to the anthropological idea of ethnography, probably somebody else than me has to answer that question.
Okay, thank you for throwing up that ball. Can I throw it to Elisabetta then?
Yeah, can I ask you to repeat the question? I want to make sure that I understood it correctly. Okay.
Yes, sure. So the question from the chat was, can digital ethnography be a core method rather than a substitute for real ethnography? Or perhaps add, like one could add, like in your case, you started, of course, out with actual being there, to say, and added on also the digital part, but could it be a core method rather than?
I mean, I would lie if I say that doing remote ethnography is as effective and good as doing ethnography in physical co-presence. There are limitations, of course, and I don't think it's good to have that optimistic attitude and tell ourselves that it's exactly the same things. There are limitations, I think, but this is the situation, and we have to do what we can do. And in these situations, I believe that digital ethnography, meaning online ethnography, can become a core method. So yes, this is my my answer. And my general tip even here is to consider digital platforms as places and contexts where people live, where people have experience. And in our research, we might need to do research in all the contexts that people inhabit and people live. And the digital is one of these contexts, it's not everything. But yes, let's try to take part in all possible contexts that people live. So this might mean doing research on different platforms, doing research on different online places, and move from one place to the other, moving from games, online gaming, to Twitter, to Instagram. So if we are able to cover all these different contexts, we could say that, yes, digital online ethnography can become a core method, I believe.
Okay, also attempting some kind of holism in this online world.
Yeah.
And John, what is your view on this?
I'll make a strong case for the pro side, I guess. I think absolutely it's a core method because people's everyday lives, they expand beyond any bounded physical setting that they might live in. And if you want to, for most things that we might want to study nowadays pertaining to people's everyday lives are going to require us to follow them around beyond just their physical interactions that they're having. So I think some version of what Elisabetta described of friending people, or even of taking a kind of more macroscopic approach, like I described, in order to see what sorts of relations seem to matter in a certain kind of place, and what kind of action is going on that we might not be able to see in the physical setting. That's going to become very important. So also not just digital ethnography becoming a method for qualitative researchers to apply as part of their standard toolkit, but maybe also the kind of interdisciplinary cooperations that allow us to get a sense of that broader picture. And also reading media studies, reading work by geographers and so on that look at that broader context is also important.
Yes, thank you. Elisabet Rasch again.
Yeah, there's there's an interesting question here for the three of you, I think, asking, is there a tension between the opportunity to decolonize and the risk of becoming an armchair ethnographer or researcher? What is your view on this? Yeah, Sonja, I think you mentioned it, right? So maybe you can start.
Yeah, I wonder what is meant by the armchair.
Yeah, that's might be quite anthropological jargon. Armchair is like referring to the anthropologists from before that sat on their veranda and just observing the people they were researching instead of engaging in their armchair.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's that's interesting in itself that this actually exists of the armchair. I think there's this potential of greater capacity building if we decolonize, and I think the outcomes we as academics want out of our research are very different from what our research participants want. So we want to write publications out of our research and communicate it within academia, while what my research participants do is they actually want to think about issues that concerns them in everyday life and how they can create some sort of social change with participating in what we do. And the impact of that can be bigger or smaller, but the less I am involved in that process, the bigger the opportunity for them actually to create an impact that is relevant to them. So yeah, so that's why I found this whole armchair argument interesting, because I think there are different things what we do. Like there are different outcomes we want to get out of it. And as much as I'm thrilled that the women I work with now know probably better how to navigate Zoom on a phone than me, and are really well connected now online, at the end, I'm also as thrilled of being able to write about it.
Yeah, that's always a complicated balance, I think, in the work that we do. Yeah. Elisabetta, can I ask you to reflect on this? And then John, you don't have to wait for my intervention to react.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a reflection about the armchair anthropologists, which I think is a risk that we are running nowadays because of the pandemic, but also because of the structure of funding that we have in the university. And I came across a lot of research projects where the ethnographers, the main researcher, was sitting at home, and there were a student assistant doing fieldwork and doing interviews. And I think that this will have a negative impact on the quality of the research that we do. And we should really be careful not to reproduce that model of armchair anthropologists, with the main researchers sitting at home writing papers and people out there doing the collection of data. So how can we solve this with the pandemic and with limitations of mobility? A possible solution is to do more research at home. I mean, this is the first thing that comes up to my mind now. So if we are limited in our movement in the next few years, let's do more research at home. Yes, this is what I'm thinking now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, nothing's more colonial in my mind than the armchair. Also historically, I guess, than the armchair anthropologist, right? Who sits in the metropole, imposing ready-made categories on what those people there might be thinking and doing, and what the meaning of their rituals and so on might be. I think the cultural ethnography and cultural anthropology and urban ethnography and these kinds of scholarly movements of the early 20th century, they very much were, about interacting with people in the field in order to not impose ready-made categories, but to create knowledge in interaction. And I think we can still do that. I mean, that's what we're talking about here, is that we can still interact with people and create knowledge with people together and try to take, the other's view into consideration and so on, even though we might be remote. So I'm optimistic that that's still possible. Or we're not any more at risk of being super colonial than we already are as privileged people in Western academia.
Thank you. I have another question of a different kind, much more practical, because I already saw somebody saying in the chat, how then do you mark, or when do you say exactly, I am doing field work now? How do you mark this in your day? And I want to link that question to another practical one, and that is, how do you take field notes, and of what do you take field notes? That's perhaps the main question here, and then to have a peek in your kitchen, so to say, like, what does your material look like? Can you say something about that? And John, you're nodding very enthusiastically. Can I just ask you to continue?
Sure. So I mean, the first part of the question, you know, how do you demarcate when you're working? I mean, when you're doing field work, which is also a way of saying when you're working and when you're not. I must say I'm doing pretty poorly at that already these days. With not leaving the house, it's very hard to differentiate between working times and non-working times. But that's something about this moment, I think. I mean, do we take field notes? What kind of materials do we gather? So I mean, I've been doing most of this work, like I said, with my co-author, with Justus Outermark, and we write a lot of the notes in the form of emails to each other. So after I went on a field visit somewhere, I would very often just write up my notes as an email to him, and then that's in my email archive, and he can read it. And then when we have a meeting once a week or so, we talk about what we recorded, what we observed, what patterns we're seeing, and so on, that kind of process. So that's, and then in terms of gathering kind of visual material, that was always kind of on a specific, you know, we're working on this chapter now, and this is what we're looking at, or we're working on this paper now, and this is what we're looking at. So then we would focus on specific materials for that. But the more longer term reflections were mostly in a written form, in the form of, sometimes more in the moment notes that I would literally type out on my phone as I was sitting somewhere, and sometimes more like in memos that we wrote to each other. And I think that's a really big part of our process, that we have this long email archive that we often go back to, that informed our discussions also. So for me, it's really hard to separate that from having this collaborative setup, which was really valuable for me to make this happen.
Yes, thank you. Sonja, can I ask you to give a peek in your kitchen?
I think doing field notes became, at least in my case, much easier because I don't have to do the notes anymore. Everything is kind of recorded. So my workshops are all recorded and shared with everybody in the team, including the women. And I think for me, what became more of a new thing is really the amount of analysis then, because it's so much audiovisual data now, which gigabytes over gigabytes to rewatch and analyze. I think in the past, in co-present research, I have a similar approach like John, where I write emails to collaborators, which has been proven in my PhD as one of the best notes I've ever taken, while my field diary was rather poorly. I think because now everything is digitally recorded, doing field notes in terms of really notes became down to a couple of keywords and time codes where I probably want to go back to, or moments.
Okay, thank you. But I wonder, isn't it also a risk that everything is recorded, and that then you start, because the field notes I take, I also often have a more reflexive kind of my own feelings, of my own emotions. Would you also, how do you record those, I wonder?
I think this is where I talk more about analysis than field notes.
Yeah.
So this is my analysis approach. What I do is, when I watch the videos, be it while the meeting takes place or when I actually put them, I actually use in vivo a lot. These are the moments where I have all these notes, but this is more so maybe we just give it different names, but for me, that's analysis.
Elisabetta, how do you do this?
Yeah, okay, so I also have a lot of recorded materials, which are interviews, basically. And then I observe my WhatsApp groups, and I take notes when I see something interesting. But because I've been teaching quite a lot in the first 2 blocks this year, I didn't do a lot of active participation. So I was taking notes when I saw something that was relevant for my research questions, and I just wrote it down on my Word document that I store on Dropbox and on Google Drive. And the advantage of WhatsApp communication is also that all the interactions are there on WhatsApp, so I can always go back to it, and that's easier, I would say, because I know that I'm not losing any material because it's there. Although it would be important also to back up the conversations. That's why I take notes, and every once in a while I look at what my informants said and I write down the notes.
Thank you. Elisabet Rasch.
Oh, sorry.
What is the next question?
Yeah, so another question that came from the chat is, how do you safeguard your own space and privacy online while doing digital research? So yeah, do you protect your own digital identity? Do people have access to that, and so on? John, can I give you the floor?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of I'm really bad at Instagram, and I'm not really on Instagram basically at all. I'm not a participant in that scene that much. It's more like I'm a participant in the everyday spaces that people that are also on Instagram hang out in. So I don't really curate like a presence there, though that master students that have worked with us have done that, and it always becomes an interesting question, like, you know, how you present yourself there. I guess I maintain a professional website. I have a kind of old school online presence that's like on my own domain, and I don't do the Facebook, and on Twitter I'm try not to be too much of an academic there, I guess. And so when people look for me, that might be, you know, thinking like, oh, who's this guy that's asking me for an interview? What they will find is a kind of very professional front, I guess, and that's what I'm going for.
Okay, thank you so much, Sonja. How do you do this?
Yeah, I think that's probably, in my research, that's not necessarily one of the key things, like for Elisabetta and John. That's like, because I do more traditional qualitative research remotely rather than digital research in that sense. The only reason I'm on Facebook is because that's the only way how I can keep in contact with participants from my PhD still. And I'm using Twitter in a professional sense. But apart from that, it's not one of my biggest concerns, I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's really the difference also in your research design, right? Yeah. Elisabetta, what's your take on this?
Yeah. So I had 2 different approaches in my research in the southeast of Turkey and the one I'm doing in Milan. So in my previous research, I opened a different Facebook account, and I was using that one. And I kept my private Facebook account divided from my research. And that was also a way for me to feel more free on my own personal Facebook account. Now in this new research, because I'm working with people that I knew before, and there is no clear line between my private life and my research, I'm using the same accounts, my personal accounts. But that has to do with the specificity of my research participants, that are people that I knew before. So it's not possible to draw a neat, clear line between private life and research.
Thank you so much. Looking at the time, Nikki is about to ask you the final question, and I know there are many more questions in the chat, but yeah, this is the way it is. So Nikki will ask the final question and then we will do a very brief wrap up.
Yeah, I think this is a question that combines some of the many questions that are asked in the chat. And so please take this one as open, I guess, as possible, because many people are asking questions about those who actually do not have access to internet or technology. And I see also a question about representation and over-representation online. So in an abstract sense, maybe this is about, okay, what can you know through this research and what can't you know, and what are perhaps silences you see in your research? John, can I start with you?
Sure. So what that makes me think of, I mean, so this is kind of about what epistemological issues might we face in doing this. Yeah, one thing that I became very aware of is that a lot of, because I've been working on social media for a couple of years now, is that a lot of the research that's out there is based on Twitter. The research on social media is based on Twitter, and it's based on Twitter analysis of like Twitter hashtag campaigns, essentially. So what people tend to find a lot is, people use social media for protest. People use social media for political communication, and people use social media as a networked or digital public sphere. And in all those cases, the difficulty is that the research kind of, what we call samples on the dependent variables. So it doesn't really take a fair picture of what goes on social media, because it looks at moments where social media were being used for protest or for critical communication or for that kind of public sphere kind of role. And then basically there's no other way but to affirm that assumption that that's what social media is indeed good for. And this has to do with the fact that, there's this kind of uneven distribution of attention in all kinds of digital spaces, where there's a small number of people that become the kind of breakout stars. And of course, those people are often identified with political communication, with being protesters, with exchanging opinions and stuff like that. But the vast majority of users are not doing anything like that. They're showing off their new shoes that they bought, or they're looking for makeup tutorial, or they're sharing makeup tutorials, or they're doing very mundane kinds of things. And I think one of the dangers of doing research in digital settings is to take whatever the first thing is that becomes the most visible, and to take that as an entry point, and then to kind of get locked in only seeing those things that are associated with with these very highly visible images, and to lose sight of all the other users that are doing quite different things. And then our image that we get of what happens in digital spaces becomes skewed very heavily toward these kind of influencers or breakout stars or what have you. And then our conclusions that we tend to draw tend to be very much skewed toward what those people's experiences are like. And that there's also a geography to this, and that most of the famous users, at least on Western social media, which is what we usually talk about when we say social media, are themselves in the West. They live in cities. They are generally upper middle class, if not above. Generally more highly educated, have all kinds of capital at their disposal, and so but we still have this kind of survival of this idea that networks are horizontal, networks are open, anybody can participate in networks, and that if we study a networked field site, that we therefore can just follow people around and get a sense for what's going on. But in fact, when we choose an entry point and follow people around, that is only half of the story, because we might then get locked in these kinds of cultural spheres on social media, or any digital space, where only the most prominent, the most visible images appear. So I've already spoken too long, so I'll leave it at that, but I hope that's clear enough.
yeah, this Elisabetta. Are you there, Elisabetta? Can I ask you to,
Yes.
to reflect on this?
Yeah, I'm here. I have some connection problems. Okay, so building on what also John has just said, my suggestion is here to, I would like to highlight and stress how important interviews are when we do remote ethnography, exactly for that reason. Otherwise, we end up studying only those who are more visible online. Whereas if we do interviews as well, it's possible to gain access to those sections of populations who are less visible in platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. So I would stress that the importance of this method, traditional method. Yes, so this is my main hint, my main tip on this.
Okay, as a way to enter also so everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, indeed. And of course, it depends also where we are doing research. I think now if you're doing research in Europe, like me in the last few years, I think there is almost no one who has no access to an internet connection. So even like, 85-year-old people who live in, they are online. So my 75-year-old mom is always on WhatsApp. She spends like 15 hours a day on WhatsApp, and she's 75. So yeah, everybody is online now, or at least most of the population in Europe is connected.
Oh, this is, I guess, very different for you, Sonja.
Yeah.
It's actually a nice bridge. Yeah, it really depends where you do your research, right? There are two things about this. So the first one is, and let's do it on the example of my research, is who has a smartphone and can participate. In Colombia, the distribution of internet and smartphones is relatively high, but of course, the quality of those, or still not everybody has access to it. So that's something we have to reflect on and be very aware and honest about, that we do exclude certain populations when doing it. But that's the digital aspect. And one thing is then when we talk about thinking about doing remote qualitative research, it doesn't necessarily need to be digital. So it's fascinating what we can do digitally, but when we talk about remote research, it can also mean that we actually get better or maybe more stronger collaborations with those locally. So it doesn't necessarily need to be me who is doing the interview in Medellin. So I can also ask a research collaborator maybe. So this is where I think when we do qualitative participatory research, or more in a traditional sense that is not digitally based, where the data is not digitally based, we can get much more creative in the future. And I think we have to. And inclusion is one of the points where we really have to reflect on and really become more innovative in the future. I think COVID has actually showed us how comfortable we have been in the past. And now we do have to get out a little bit from our comfort zone and think about, okay, how can we do that differently? And how can we maybe even continue to do things differently?
Yes, well, I think that's a very nice ending actually of this conversation. As anthropologists, we should be we're in the business of getting out of our comfort zones, and we should also do this in relation to fieldwork, remote or not. So, Elisabet, I think you will say some closing words. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. I mean, this was really so inspiring and interesting, and still so much left to talk about, actually. So I would really like to thank Sonja, Elisabetta, and John for sharing their experiences, for being here with us, but also all from all over the world who logged into our event. And I hope that you yeah, that it will help you in your future or ongoing research. At least it has given us a lot to think about. More, I think, more questions than we started with. Yeah, I just put up the slide again to be able to direct you to our website, our Facebook page, in case you want more information about what we do. There you can also find more information about our speakers. If you are interested in their publications, in what they do, their project websites. So please go and have a look. As I told you, at the very start, this event has been recorded, so I think that means you will also be able to enter the chat in the recording and have access to all the links and the resources that were shared in the chat, which is also really great. So thanks a lot for that as well. Yeah, what more can I say? Thank you so much. I think this event is now being closed when when we give the sign, so to say. So enjoy your evening. Thanks again for participating. It was great having you, and I hope to see you all in real life or remotely, digitally. And have a nice day. Enjoy your evening. Sleep well. Yeah, see you soon. Thank you so much for being here.